Okay, and so now we're going to look at, whew, let me tell you, World War II had a lot of impacts. And part four, and this one is going to focus at the overall economic impact. One of the things to keep in mind as we do this is that we're looking at everything overall, and keep all of this in mind when we start talking specifically about the other European countries. And you've seen these learning outcomes before. Keep at it. If there are going to be social changes, there are going to be economic impacts as well. So here's an overall view of some of the economic impacts of World War II. So, as we know, the economies of most countries were absolutely devastated by the war. There was this isolation of people in rural areas, especially as infrastructure was destroyed. And so between the countryside and the city, there's not that, communication. That is the roads that help bring the goods that each side produces. This was a total war. That means that it was a total war that lasted for a long time. And this means that essentially every dime that they had, or every, pence or something, dimes are very American. Every penny, that they had was put into fighting this war. So essentially, the countries had no money left to rebuild. This was a long, costly war, and countries weren't prepared for war. So there was a huge amount of debt. The United States and Canada, I know, are the least affected. And this is going to be beneficial to the US and Canada because essentially they had functioning economies to help pump into Europe. At the same time, this means that they are the only ones, mainly the US, that is able to inject money into these economies. As you know, there are high levels of unemployment. So the shift from wartime economy, we have a lot of people who had been working in the military who are now unemployed because you don't need that large of a standing army during peacetime. You have factories and industries, infrastructure completely destroyed. So they are not available to be able to absorb people. Factories that are still standing, they're no longer making munitions to be used in the war and other war material. So they also can't employ people. So high levels of unemployment and all of those problems that brings about. One of the things, of course, is we have food shortages. Part of that was infrastructure. Part of that is shifting towards wartime economy. Part of that is bombs. People would not enough people to work to produce food, complete. And part of that also is there, if infrastructure isn't there, then that means that the food that may be produced doesn't have a way to get to the markets that need it. You have strikes and civil unrest, and people are scared. People are homeless. People are hungry. People are demanding that the government does something. And at the same time, these governments are in no shape to be able to deal with these issues. Agricultural industrial levels weren't growing, and that contributes to the level of unemployment, contributes to food shortages, and therefore contributes to the strikes and civil unrest. And so here we have, I do love saying, and so here we have quite a bit. I'm sure you've noticed. There is an image of people protesting the civil in West Germany. And so this is an example of the civil unrest. People are upset about the lack of food. People are cold. And you can see that in the 2 years since the war ended, you see that that building in the back is still destroyed. So there hasn't been an improvement in the situation post-war for a couple of years at least. And so we have shifting of the economy with the destruction of the infrastructure. And so essentially, it's really difficult for the economy to recover and attempt to go back to a peacetime economy. And this is going to be worse because we have huge numbers of displaced people, homeless or refugees, that need resources. They need food, they need shelter, they need clothes, they need water. And so the U.S. and Britain shut down the arms industry in the Federal Republic of Germany, and part of that in attempt to that demilitarization of Germany. And this, of course, means, well, less work. And so Germany faces an embargo on raw materials to be able to prevent them from creating arms and stuff. The equipment, factories were removed. And so this kind of attempt to demilitarize and deindustrialize in a way, Germany, results in a hindering of economic recovery of the rest of Europe. So one of the things that we see at the end of World War I and we see here is that Germany is integral to the functioning of the economy in Europe. And so they see that this is a problem. And so because this is a problem, they implement the Marshall Plan, or also known as the European Recovery Program. And this was in place from 1948 to 1952. And so the whole purpose of this essentially was a realization that an industrialized Germany is important in Europe's economy. And it was before World War I, it was in the interwar period as well. And then, and it continues to do so today. So Germany is in Central Europe. It essentially is like the heartland of Europe. And as a producer and as a consumer, she is important to the economy of the other countries. And if there is no industrialized Germany, then that's going to make things difficult for other countries. And so one of the things that happens is there is the recognition that the economic impacts, the negative economic impacts of the Paris Peace Treaties of 1918 helped to contribute to the rise of fascism and contributed to the instability in Europe. And so what they're attempting to do here is not repeat the mistakes of the past. And as you know, or maybe you don't know, but you should remember that John Maynard Keynes was a vocal critic of the Paris Peace Treaties, their economic impact, and predicted this sort of instability that was going to happen. And so he's also involved in this process. And once you have, by the time we get to 1948, and it's 3 years after the war, and it's like successive civil unrest and so on and so forth, there is this, and you also have the heating up of the Cold War. Again. The fear of communism is gigantic. That's right, gigantic. And so the idea is that if the economies don't recover, if there isn't an improvement in people's lives, then that means that it provides an opportunity for people to turn toward extremism, and that is communism. And so what this Marshall Plan was supposed to do, the purpose of it, was to help remove trade barriers and modernize industry so that economies were more competitive and more efficient. And we'll talk more about the Marshall Plan as part of our HL unit. All right. The Marshall Plan was rejected by the Soviet Union. Essentially, the Soviet Union saw this as the US's attempt to create hegemony and extend her influence. And so the Soviet Union saw that they would essentially be economically under the control of the US. One of the things that the U.S. did is that they requested or demanded or made as part of participation in the Marshall Plan, their financial books had to be open to these technical and economic helpers who are coming in. So essentially, there would be no economic secrets. And the Soviet Union saw that as a loss of sovereignty. Now, part of the Marshall Plan included economic help, and that economic help came in the form of money, but it also included economists, so specialists who would go in and try to reorganize stuff. And then it also included technical help. So one of the U.S.'s industry had leapfrogged over others in terms of efficiency. And so it was some of these technical experts on how to organize factories and how to build factories and stuff like that who came in to help the European countries. And so between 1945 to 1952, 25 billion was given to sort of inject money into these economies. And unlike the Dawes and Young plans, this was free. So again, lessons learned from the situation with those plans and the dependency that those plans created. The purpose of the Marshall Plan was actually to help the countries recover on their own, not necessarily become dependent on loans. Now, of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. In addition to helping that money investing in the economies of European countries, those countries needed to buy manufactured goods and they needed to buy food and stuff until their domestic industries recovered. And so the US and Canada, whose industries were intact, definitely benefited. By the end of 1952, the economies of all of the countries who participated in the Marshall Plan were better than pre-war levels. So it was very successful. And as one of the purposes was to remove trade barriers within Europe, this actually helped to integrate the European economies together more closely, and this helped to pave the road for European integration and the EU that we have today. Baby steps, but the Marshall Plan laid the foundation. And so right after the war, countries basically implemented austerity measures. They had to save money. They had to prioritize with the limited funds that they had where that money was going to go. And this is one of the things that created civil unrest, because people are hungry. People need stuff now. People need housing. People need support and some of that welfare state stuff. And so this meant that with the funds coming in, the governments didn't have to be quite so tight-fisted with the money, which meant that they could begin to meet people's needs sooner, and the result is going to be more civil stability. And here we have one of these propaganda posters that were distributed after the implementation of the Marshall Plan. The idea is, Europe banding together to make everything happen. And so it's just letting people know that there is something happening and kind of trying to drum up that moral support and that commitment that you need from the people, especially in democracies, in order for things like this to be successful. Essentially, they were asking people to calm down a little bit, that they were working toward making things happen, and that everybody needs to contribute to making it a success. And here we have a map of where the money went. So you can see which countries in Europe, primarily, France and Britain receiving the most funds. And you haven't had a red question in a while, so here one goes. And so a question that often comes up is to ask you to compare and contrast the impacts of World War I and World War II. So I'm going to ask you to pause. This is the end of this video, and go back to the stuff that we did previously, looking at the impacts of World War I, and compare and contrast with the videos that you've looked at so far about World War II. Please, 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 please do this, because this is going to help you sort of sift through and pull together information, and it's also a nice bit of revision.